Greetings, everyone. Good people, thanks for coming. My name is John Fan, and I'm the head of research and programs at the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, and I'd like to welcome you to today's presentation, which is part of our ongoing Benjamin A. Botkin lecture series. First, a bit about the American Folklife Center. The center documents and shares the many expressions of human experience to inspire, revitalize, and perpetuate living cultural traditions. Designated by the U.S. Congress as the National Center for Folklife Documentation and Research, the center meets its mission by stewarding archival collections, creating public programs, and exchanging knowledge and expertise. The Botkin Lecture Series allows AFC to highlight the work of leading thinkers and scholars in disciplines related to cultural heritage, such as folklore, ethnomusicology, oral history, and documentation, while enhancing and expanding the collection here at the American Folklife Center. The Botkin Lectures are also an important part of the acquisition activities for both the center and the library. Each lecture is video recorded by our wonderful colleagues at MMG and will become part of the center's resources. It'll be processed and then put online for anyone to freely access with a high-speed internet connection. So on that note, it's a good time to turn off your phone now, or else you'll make it into the recording. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Joe Zavon Johnson, a multi-instrumentalist, arts educator, and Black music researcher. In critically examining Black banjo recovery projects at the intersection of Black studies, human geography, folklore, and ethnomusicology, he also frequently collaborates with grassroots organizations working towards coalition building, community healing, and cultural reparations. Joe is currently a PhD candidate in ethnomusicology at Indiana University, Bloomington. We know him well here at the American Folklife Center because in 2023, he spent the summer with us as an intern after being selected for a highly competitive paid internship. And there's 3 other interns in the room right now, too. It's always nice to have them back. During his time at the center, Joe produced a thorough research guide for materials about African-American banjo players that we hold here at the Library of Congress. It's easily accessible online. He also helped produce the center's America Works podcast series on occupational folklife. He was a wonderful intern and colleague, and we look forward to working with him on future projects. Finally, I should mention that Joe is an outstanding musician and music teacher, and I hope many of you have heard him perform or will hear him perform, engage with him somehow. So please join me in welcoming Joe for his presentation, Black Banjo Bodylands, Co-Constructions of a Musical Instrument. We are delighted to have him back here with us.
Thanks, John. Saturday, April 9th, 2005, Appalachian State University, Boone, North Carolina, late evening. The presentations had ended and polite applause faded into the night air of the first Black banjo gathering. Then rising elder Sule Greg Wilson stood at the edge of the stage knowing that something essential was missing. The music had been shared, the stories were told, the academics had poo-pooed, but the weekend remained a sterile performance, distant, formal, and untouchable. Then he began to sing. The melody rose from somewhere deep within him. As a decades-long liturgical musician for Yoruba ritual, Sule's body knew which songs to sing. Then Dom, Rhiannon, Joe, and others joined in with their instruments, tentative at first, but then with growing confidence. What had been presentations transformed into participation. Banjos, fiddles, guitars, voices wove together in an organic tapestry that no program organizer could have scripted. For about 30 minutes, that magic built, and then West African musician Daniel Jota rose from the audience with an accounting in his hand. The Ghanaian strings started to sing, bridging continents and centuries, as Sule felt tears roll down his face. This was that moment when novel spectacle began to transform into a living, in-person community, when the artificial and previously only known as online beings became real. Jota had waited, watching until he recognized that shift. Only when the gathering became real, when folks from many walks of life found their rhythm together, did he add his voice to that conversation. That jam stretched late into the night, 3 or 4 hours of musical communion. Instruments came out of nowhere. fiddles, bones, spoons, lumberjacks, voices, hands, and feet. The circle expanded and contracted like a breathing being, welcoming whoever felt that pull. In that sacred space between Saturday and Sunday, the first Black Banjo gathering found its soul. This moment of transformation, when formal presentation dissolved into organic communion, marked more than just the end of the event. It signaled to me the beginning of what would later be recognized as the Black Banjo Renaissance, a movement that would reclaim and revitalize African American string band traditions across the country. What happened in those pre-dawn hours wasn't just music, it was cultural reclamation, community building, and a birth of a revitalizing chapter in American roots music. 20 years have passed since the first Black Banjo gathering in 2005, marking a critical juncture in investigating new relationships between Black people and the banjo. Though the Black Banjo gathering was more than, and some would refute that it wasn't at all, a magical convergence of Black people, and that nuance is a topic of a different portion of my research project, a little tangential from today's talk. But despite decades of research on the instrument's African diasporic origins, the banjo's Black life remains obscured by conservative musical alliances that have haphazardly painted over the Black roots of American roots music. This contemporary moment is marked by a movement known as the Black Banjo Renaissance, a term popularized by Rhiannon Giddens. It builds on her and her peers' decades-long grassroots work reclaiming the banjo as part of living Black cultural heritage. This movement extends beyond the accumulation of historical facts in that it is fueled by people who are celebrating, innovating, and reinvigorating connections between Black people and American roots music. As a Black music researcher, musician, and member of this community, I define the Black Banjo Renaissance as a rebirth of Black consciousness and engagement between Black people and the banjo, with broader recognition of the historic roles that Black people played in the foundation of American roots music. By looking at this rebirth of Black consciousness, I believe that my in-depth study of the relationships between Black bodies and the banjo can ultimately help ethnomusicologists and folklorists reflect more critically on how we project interpretive meanings onto the people and the objects that we study. As part of my work, it is especially important to emphasize the use of the capital B in Black to signify the Renaissance's ongoing process of learning from, honoring, and building on the legacy of Black ancestors. Although I professionally identify as a Black music researcher, PhD candidate, and a musician, it is important to highlight that in my study of the Black Banjo Renaissance, I am also a tradition bearer and culture bearer in my identity and performance practice. My story as a practitioner is inseparable from my story as a researcher, and it has compelled me to reflect deeply on the ways that Black people are simultaneously marked and obscured when performing and working with the banjo. This reflection brings me to W.E.B. Du Bois' concepts of double consciousness, the color line, and the veil. But for the purposes of today's discussion, particularly because today I'm in drag as an academically trained researcher, the most relevant is the veil, or the symbolic converging, which obscures Black life from dominant Euro-American culture. Like the Black Banjo Gatherings in 2005's focus on white researchers' curation of the banjo's Black life. Beyond the veil, Black communities live fully. We create culture, we produce knowledge, and we share technology and resources that sustain our own lives. From the outside, however, this richness is often distorted, misinterpreted, or ignored altogether. Although I won't be lifting the veil for you today, I implore you all to ask yourselves how these concepts can influence your interpretations of Black banjo practitioners. This presentation today is exploring the banjo as a dynamic site of social transformation rather than a static artifact. I will argue that this instrument serves as both material object and social force, particularly in the hands of Black practitioners who use its construction to engage with ancestral memory, land, and community. But before I dive too far into my research, I want to pause and share my deep gratitude to John and Nancy and Doug and Thea and the entire staff here at the American Folklife Center. After having the chance to work here in 2023, I think it was, it truly feels like an honor and a joy to get to return here to the library to share more of my work. This place is quickly becoming one of my intellectual homes, and I'm continually inspired by the dedication that you all bring to preserving and honoring the cultural heritage of the United States. Today's talk is going to unfold in 3 parts: the past, present, and the future past. First, the present, well, I'll bring you all into my mind to establish a theoretical framework for how I understand the banjo as a Black captive body, positioning it as a vehicle that is revealed, or a vehicle for profound cultural engagement that is revealed through the theory of Black banjo bodylands. In this, I will also examine previous scholarship and discuss the banjo's function as an agent of social change. Second, in the present, I will shift focus to 2 contemporary Black banjo builders, exploring how their craft represents more than just instrument making. It embodies the reclamation and preservation of cultural epistemologies rooted in land, ancestry, and community organizing. Then, in the future past, I will also briefly demonstrate how these building practices illuminate the instrument's historical physical evolution from an early archival example to the modern open-back banjo. Through this discussion, we will see how contemporary Black banjo builders are not simply crafting instruments, but actively working to sustain, transform the banjo's bodylands in the past, present, and the future. Past. Sticks and bricks will break our bones, but words will most certainly kill us. Hortense Spillers. Cecilia Conway's 1995 book, African Banjo Echoes in Appalachia, represents the most recent and well-known ethnographic examination of once living African American banjo players. In the text, she notated the lives of ancestors Dink Roberts, Libba Cotton, Joe Thompson, and his cousin Odell at the end of the 20th century. Her framing positions these musicians as the last remnants of a dying tradition, or as she puts it, the, quote, mountain echoes of the African banjo, end quote. The interview and musical material associated with this work have been monumentally important to my musical journey and that of many of my musical mentors. Their work in this area focuses on banjo players in the 70s and 80s as quote-unquote pre-blues fragments of an ancient African past. It relies on assumptions commonly held by folklorists of the time that pre-American ancestral traditions of non-indigenous people were preserved in the relative isolation of the Appalachian region. Conway noted on multiple occasions that the banjo and its Black players were from Africa. Here, the language used in the preface, like her description of informant Dink Roberts in the 1980s as, quote, seasoned, shamanic, and seemed old enough to have come from Africa. This positions contemporary post-blues Black beings as having no individual agency since their ancestors lived in Africa over 100 years prior. This framing, like Dink and his lineage of banjo players, marks them as ontologically dead beings, reflecting Hortense Spiller's interpretation of Black beings being violently murdered again and again and again, as our lives are only rendered as dead history. The focus on Africa by Conway and other researchers, still held by numerous contemporary players, refutes the archival record that shows, as of right now, that the banjo first emerged in the Caribbean as a new creation that came from the merger of multiple African instrumental knowledge systems from across the continent. In its time, Conway's research was writing against the prevailing and violently racist grain that refused to acknowledge any connections between Black people and the banjo. Therefore, her work was groundbreaking in its historical time. However, much has changed in our understanding of the banjo's history since then. Conway's approach exists within a trend of folklore studies at the time that's rooted in nostalgia for the other's past, which characterizes much of mid-late 20th century folklore studies. Even I, when I started my research journey about 10 years ago, began with the broad and ambitious goal about talking about the living tradition, singular, of the Black banjo playing and making, hoping it would take me to Yorubaland or Eritrea, only to quickly realize that there are multiple traditions, multiple lineages, and numerous ways to be Black in the United States and work with the banjo. However, my very broad study appears to be necessary to create space and a precedent for future academic research to detail the specifics of these multiple lineages. The recreation of Conway's imagination of the banjo in Black hands, based in her research, largely reflects the general population's understanding of the instrument's history, and it renders Black lives through colonial logics that fetishize the stagnant historical Black other. It traps living traditions within museum-like frameworks that deny our contemporary vitality and ongoing transformation. So I would say it's not just Conway. I've seen this repeated in numerous festivals, numerous events, numerous camps, numerous performance spaces that are all based on this outdated understanding. I'm using Conway's work primarily as an example because despite its age being basically 30 years old now, it's 2025, right? 30 years old now, is because it's the most recent ethnographic study in this area, and it has not received the 30 years of critical reassessment that all work deserves. Focusing on only African origins takes away the historical agency of enslaved people who were innovated in the face of brutality, and it reinforces the white supremacist myth that nothing creative happened during the period of enslavement. This constitutes what Calvin Warren calls an ontological terror, or a process of metaphysical arguing and reasoning that relies on the false assumption using Western European knowledge systems to understand a Black culture that ultimately renders Blackness through the act of simple representation as non-human but yet functional beings who exist for the sake of supporting white culture. The terror of such academic exercises and ontologies renders Black bodies and Black existences and Black knowledge systems as null and void. The voiding of the Black ways of being happens in Conway's ethnographic study and in the common understanding of the banjo's Black origins. A musical mentor of mine, Justin Robinson, described it as, quote, jumping straight from 2006 back to Africa, end quote, ultimately ignoring 4 centuries of Black ingenuity here in the Americas, the sum of which, the banjo's ancestry, becomes nothingness, so that we Black beings are fashioned into simple function of either preserving our ancient African past, or 2, as a support system for white America, denying our existences and innovations as ontological people outside of that white gaze. These functions, according to Conway's analysis of Black banjo players, are to ultimately protect altruistic, white saviorist understandings of the white self, while emphasizing how the banjo ended up in white hands and in white ears. This history of violence demands approaches that resist reducing living practices to historical curiosities. Therefore, I activate a theory known as Bodylands from Ana Maurine Laura, which provides crucial language to help me understand and interpret these interconnected relationships beyond simple folkloric factoids. Bodylands indexes the, quote, relationships and simultaneous co-constructions of bodies and the lands across through on which those bodies exist, end quote, recognizing both land and body as entities whose social realities are fundamentally interrelated and always in motion. It suggests that the bodies and lands through which they have moved share water, minerals, and memories that profoundly impact one another's growth. Through an engagement with our bodylands, I believe that we can reach back to commune with our ancestors, particularly with the help of tools like musical instruments and other ritual implements to activate those memories into the here and now. Bodylands provides an entry point for ethnomusicologists and folklorists to begin thinking about what my people know as a Sankofa ideology, or the practice of going back to go forward, rather than fetishizing the black banjo playing as remnants of an ancient past, rather than connecting with our bodylands simply to reconstruct the past, black banjo players in the present use our knowledge of the banjo's black past to literally construct a black banjo future. This approach recognizes how the subjective reality of time and the knowledge of the banjo's African diasporic origins can be deployed to envision new ways of being simultaneously in the present, future, and in the past. In this realm, the banjo lands and black bodies do not just change with time, but actually create, transform, and reconstitute one another in their relational engagement. This cyclical movement of time transcends simple intellectual exercises to become deeply personal, spiritual, and fundamental to practitioners' relationships, to time, space, place, and the dead. For many in my community of translocal and trans-temporal black banjo players and builders, engaging with ancestral knowledges through instruments represents not just historical preservation, but active world building, imagining, and creating futures for the banjo led and defined by black beings. These critically fabulated subjectivities create possibilities for contemporary practitioners to conjure ancestral voices not as museum pieces, but as living guides for cultural transformation. Therefore, I coined the phrase Black Banjo Bodylands as an analytical framework that recognizes the banjo not as artifact, but as a conceptual site where black bodies, ancestral memory, and land-based knowledge converge in ongoing transformation. This approach challenges the disciplining of African American instruments within traditional folkloric frameworks, which I will discuss in a moment, opening up space for the Black ontological self-determination that honors the past while actively creating the future. Present. As part of my study of the banjo's Black Bodylands, I was generously awarded a grant from Indiana University's Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society just before their funding got pulled from the state. With those funds, I had the opportunity to work with a handful of banjo builders to learn about their craft. Primarily, I got to spend time on the farm of Sister Dr. Dina Jennings near Orange, Virginia, where I built a banjo for the first time. Sister Dr. Dina represents a unique convergence of medical science, traditional craft, and spiritual practice in the landscape of Black banjo builders. Raised in Northern Ohio and currently residing on her Central Virginia farm, Dr. Dina operates approximately 100 acres of land with her husband, lovingly known as the Farm Ashram Monastery. As an internal medicine physician, holistic healer, and member of the Episcopal Order of the Daughters of the King, her approach to banjo building integrates her scientific curiosity of the natural world and spiritual reverence for nature. At the Farm Ashram Monastery, which you can see on the screen, a map that she drew in the style of a fantasy novel, which is her favorite genre of literature, Dina and her husband Don maintain a wood shop, process wood from local trees, grow food and medicinal plants, treat medical clients, host meditative and religious retreats, and much more. They also put on an annual festival known as the Afro-Latin On-Time Music Gathering, also known as the Thing. The Thing brings together multiple Black Appalachian and Appalachian-adjacent musicians, artists, and creatives for a weekend of community and fellowship. Community members who have participated in the Thing, lovingly known as Thangsters, are the main avenue through which I met Dr. Dina about 3 years ago. Another space for banjo construction I'd like to discuss this afternoon is a project known as the Black Banjo Reclamation Project, abbreviated BBRP, ran and organized by Hannah Mary. Based in the greater San Francisco Bay Area, the BBRP was created out of Mary's life as a traveler. Mary, who uses pronouns they, she, was born and raised in Sacramento, but spent most of their adult life as a musician in the U.S. traveler community and as an itinerant permaculture farmer with the worldwide opportunities on organic farms. Mary explained to me that in 2018, while they were residing in Bellingham, Washington, they observed a need within their small Black community. At that time, the Black banjo renaissance was just starting to enter this current era of incredible interest. In one of our interviews last year, they said, quote, "There were a lot of Black folks who wanted to play the banjo but just needed to get hooked up," end quote. And therefore, Hannah began organizing donations and later hosting banjo building workshops using the name the Black Banjo Reclamation Project. In their interviews, they often emphasized economic barriers like banjo costs and cultural barriers like the need for community spaces that did not require, in their mind, to quote unquote assimilate to whiteness as some of those primary obstacles to hooking up their friends. Their understanding of cultural barriers was primarily informed by their personal experiences of fetishization and instrumentalization within predominantly white spaces where they grew up and white spaces among the US traveler musician community. On the screen, you can see an example of a gourd instrument that I built with Dr. Dina on the left, and we'll hear an example of me playing it a little bit later on. That features a lot of similarities to early gourd banjos, but has been modified in some ways to fit my modern playing technique. Then on the right is my standard fare modern fretted open back banjo, which was mass manufactured in the 2010s by the company Gold Tone in one of their Korean-owned factories in China. This and banjos like it is the type of banjo that's most commonly played in contemporary old-time practice, mainly old-time music, but also you find it in other genres. But we'll also hear an example of this banjo being played in a minute when we talk about sonic differences. Both of the builders that I'm discussing focus on gourd instruments for a variety of reasons. They both cited the relationships to the natural world with accessibility of materials to everyday people for the purpose of sharing their knowledge on building and growing materials as paramount. Dr. Dina conveyed to me on multiple occasions during my apprenticeship that knowing and trusting the hands that have shaped your instrument are paramount. In addition to material sourcing, both cited connections to the sound of gourd banjos that resonated with them differently than that of the modern fretted banjo, as gourd banjos also have a significant historic importance in the banjo's Black life. In Conway's analysis of the banjo's cultural provenance, she jokingly suggests that the banjo was from Africa, but it was polished and given a fifth string by Joel Sweeney. This metaphor of a blackface minstrel performer represents a crucial starting point for understanding how histories of the banjo have been constructed. While she recognizes the African or African diasporic origins of the instrument and its original form as a gourd instrument, her analysis centers, quote, its change over time and its incorporation into the music of rural white America, end quote. Conway's analysis of banjos, the subject-object, draws on Henry Glassey's early folkloric model for studying material culture, which is based on form as an unchanging part of the object. Therefore, the analysis primarily focuses on the object's form, then its process of construction, and then the object's use. So when we're thinking about form, using that Glassian model, they're primarily thinking about primary and secondary characteristics, primary being like large, obvious differences, like a gourd versus a wooden rim, or like whether it has like, yeah, basically gourd versus wooden rim. Secondary elements of form being some of the smaller details, like you'll see on my gourd banjo, I have like a little flower detail that I did with the skin, or things like colors or engravings or special markings as well. And then when thinking about construction, this model primarily looks at who made the object. So either an artisan-made object with traditional knowledge in the master model, like what I did with Dr. Dina, or the human-made, something that you're learning from a book how to make the object, or a mass-manufactured object where you're essentially giving instructions to a machine to punch together instruments. And then third, they look at the object's use. So in this space, it's not social use, but categorical use. So as in the difference between using this object as a musical instrument versus a flower pot or a cooking implement. This methodological framework creates significant limitations by treating form as an unchanging part of the instrument and focusing on categorical rather than social use. Conway's early Glassian approach cannot fully engage with the culture from which the banjo emerged or account for how cultural contexts shape both form and function in this contemporary moment. That methodological gap becomes significant when we consider how the banjo functions within contemporary Black communities and the spiritual dimensions that have been identified by historians like Christina Gaddy. In Christina Gaddy's book, Well of Souls, she looks at the banjo's potential relationship to spiritual practices that extend its role beyond the secular folk object that Conway makes it out to be. She illuminated the provenance of historical instruments like the Haitian banjo from the 1840s that can be used to demonstrate how gourd instruments maintained potential connections to ancestral veneration practices found in a variety of African traditional religions. In conversation with banjo historian Pete Ross, they assert that the Haitian banjo reflects an early Congo cosmogram, which is essentially a map of the world of the living and the world of the dead, separated by the Kalunga River. There are details like the engraving on the fingerboard, as well as historical descriptions of its similarities to ritual instruments and implements usages that relate to the Loa or water spirit Simbi. In my larger work, I suggest that gourd banjos are among one of a constellation of gourd instruments in the African diaspora, but again, that's a little tangential from today's talk. So I'd like to shift the thinking of primacy of form and construction to a broader model that understands banjos through their social function. Instead of limiting analysis to physical design, Gaddy's organological approach emphasizes the multiple categories of usage that shapes their role in society. This approach aligns with my personal understanding of Black music in that sacred and secular music functions not really in separate spheres, but ultimately together and interchangeable. Knowing that Black musicians are often resisting those rigid boundaries, making the social context central to my study. Building on the banjo's role in Haitian voodoo practices, its history becomes inseparable from fears it evoked among colonial authorities. In the wake of the Haitian Revolution, there we go. In the wake of the Haitian Revolution, a movement started by a voodoo ritual, gatherings, percussions, and African diasporic expressions were increasingly surveilled and criminalized across the Caribbean and the Americas, a pattern that persists in different forms today. I believe that the banjo itself was swept into these dynamics, yet it also resonated with white audiences, which drove structural changes to adapt the instrument to a white musical milieu. So the physical construction changes also influence the sound. So I'd like to now listen to two examples of the same tune being played on this gourd instrument and then also me playing it again on my modern fretted banjo so we can talk about some of those sonic differences and changes in the instrument. So let's listen first to my gourd banjo. This is a recording of me playing a tune known as Briggs' Corn Shucking Jig from the Briggs Banjo Instructor, which is a manual from the 1850s. Now, let's listen to the same tune played on the modern fretted banjo, and it's important to note these instruments are in different tunings. The gourd banjo is in a lower tuning. The modern fretted banjo is up a fourth. right, so we'll hear two immediate differences between these objects. So first, other than the tunings being different, we'll notice the gourd banjo is something that's built with a fruit, and it's all organic materials. And with the large resonating chamber of the gourd, we do hear a lot more of those undertones. We hear a lot, and some might call it like a plunkier sound. When on the modern fretted banjo, we have this open back setting, we have primarily metal vibrating against metal. So gourd banjos, this one was strung up with a nalgut string, which is essentially nylon that's created to imitate the sound of like organic like catgut strings, which essentially has my fingers vibrating against a flat fingerboard with this organic-ish material against organic material, creating this really, really warm sound. When the modern fretted banjo is strung up with steel strings, and it has steel or metal frets on the instrument going up and down the neck to mark where pitches are. This creates a number of different changes, making the sound a lot sharper, a lot brighter, more tinny, more metallic, the ways that we might have our understandings of the banjo existing. But also, what's important is also with the frets, we have it limited so the banjo can only really play notes within like the dodecaphonic or 12-tone note system that exists in Western music, most Western music, which limits some of the musical expression possibilities, whereas the gourd banjo with the organic material vibrating on organic material also is fretless, which allows for a lot more pitch variation in my mind, much more flexibility on intonation, and much more flexibility for finding the pitches in between pitches. Reducing that banjo to a secular instrument misses some of those deeper cultural and communal significances to the banjo in Black communities. Though this banjo has a relatively flat action for the strings, historic banjos, as other historians have pointed out to me, typically have a much sharper angle of the strings, allowing for you to only really play maybe 3 or 4 notes on each string of the instrument, which might seem limiting to some, but to others, if you know liturgical music for Yoruba and voodoo rituals, you don't need more than 4 or 5 notes to play these ritual songs and ritual tunes. And that gets into a whole other thing about some of the ritual elements of older gourd banjos, but we'll move on with the presentation. Future past. Beyond sound, the practices of constructing the banjo, teaching its performance, and transmitting its history holds vital functions in that precede technical skill. In this way, the banjo's power actually lies in how it activates communities and memory making, fostering fellowship and enabling Black communities to collectively imagine their self-sufficiency and cultural continuity through the shared object. Dr. Dina's approach to banjo construction reflects her comprehensive philosophy of land stewardship and ancestral connection. With 50 acres of wooded land on her higher Piedmont region farm in Virginia, she sources nearly all of her materials from the farm, except for nylon strings, friction pegs, and certain hardware components like copper wire and tacks. The farm ashram monastery's challenging clay soil conditions create specific constraints and opportunities for community engagement. While difficult for conventional agriculture, the wooded acreage provides access to various hardwoods requiring approximately 1 year of curing time, and that corresponds approximately with the gourd curing periods, creating a natural rhythm and annual instrument constructions that synchronize material preparation with the seasonal cycles. It's also, I'd like to just brag a little bit that the banjo that I got to build with Dina primarily used American chestnut wood because she had a tree on her land that was just beginning to show signs of blight. So she cut it down, processed it into wood, and now my gourd banjo, you can't see all the details in the picture, has these like little tiny holes in it where you can see where the blight was starting to set in, and it creates this really pretty pattern through the instrument, but that's a whole another thing. So further, Dr. Dina also collaborates with her farmer neighbors to create multiple 20-foot tall industrial size piles of compost and mulch on her land that she uses as soil amendment to grow crops, medicines, and her gourds. Her banjo building mentor, Jeff Menzies, influenced her to start processing her own goatskin heads, guided by that principle of knowing whose hands were touching. But now she purchases her heads from Menzies directly, who processes those goatskins from his land in Jamaica. For lack of a better phrase, she likes to keep it in the family whenever she can. And that shift reflects practical craft considerations and deeper questions about supply chains, labor practices, and cultural authenticity. But further, that usage of materials from her farm just emphasizes, again, wanting to focus it and source things from the land. Dr. Jennings articulates her banjo building practice by saying she, quote, makes gourd instruments from compost to stage, end quote, indicating a holistic approach encompassing soil preparation, plant cultivation, material processing, instrument construction, and musical performance. This philosophy reflects what she describes as following her ancestral practices, quote, her ancestors were just using what's around, end quote. Hannah Maurie's connection to banjo building developed through consultation with banjo makers like Jeff Menzies and others, leading to the BBRP's first banjo build event. Project expansion included partnering with sponsors and connecting with experienced woodworkers, culminating in a 10-day workshop that accommodated 15 participants, representing a significant portion of the community demand she identified. You can see images from that workshop on the bottom left corner of the screen. For the first banjo build, Maury first received gourds from a local Amish farmer and crafted neck blanks, or rough-cut banjo necks, for participants to later shave down. Now, Maury, in collaboration with their network of agricultural workers involved with the worldwide opportunities on organic farms, is working to establish a handful of black gourd farming operations across the country to supply the BBRP. One of these operations is at Maury's home in Northern California. To Maury, the economies of banjo construction matters just as much as the energy being embedded in those materials. Therefore, it's a major desire of theirs to establish Black-owned and Black-run networks to grow, construct, and distribute banjos to Black people to avoid pitfalls of the white gaze. The evolution of the banjo from gourd-derived instruments to modern manufacturing also represents more than just a technological advancement, as it constitutes a fundamental transformation of the spiritual and cultural agency of the instrument. Originally crafted from these natural materials like gourds, animal skins, plant fibers, it employs ancestor veneration practices by Black communities, and the banjo also served, again, as both a musical instrument and sacred object, connecting practitioners to ancestral wisdom and spiritual power. Conway and others' framework positions changes like S.S. Stewart's fret additions and Baltimore maker William E. Boucher's standardized construction methods as progressive improvements, emphasizing how 5-string designs enabled more notes and flatter string actions expanded the technical possibilities. The intervention of social use revealed to me that these supposed improvements functioned as mechanisms of cultural control. The standardization process from construction methods to tuning systems served to normalize European-derived musical culture while systematically marginalizing African-derived communal land-based music practices. And that transition from natural to manufactured thus represents not progress, but a transmorgification, a grotesque and bizarre transformation of the body, which reduces the instrument's spiritual efficacy while shifting its musical functionality for different cultural purposes. The physical spaces of construction also reveal contrasting approaches to craft. Jennings works within a fully equipped wood shop on her Virginia farm. Power tools carry out rough cuts, while hand tools and meticulous scraping completes the shaping process by Dina and her apprentice, if there's one in the shop that day. I even have a really lovely memory of me and Dina and her other apprentice, Samaria, working on instruments quietly while there is an ASMR video of the Nottingham plantation on fire. It was a really great moment. Mary's spaces are more mobile than Jennings and are often more communal. Her builds often take place in classrooms, community centers, or grassroots startup workshops where collective learning defines that environment. In 2022, when I was visiting one of her builds in Chicago, she even guided a group of elementary schoolers with power tools in their playground on building their instruments. It was quite a sight. So in contrast with the factory production between these gourd instruments and, again, like the modern fretted banjo is very striking. As banjos became increasingly standardized through industrial processes, they were distanced from these different intimate workshop contexts. The shift from handmade to mass-produced paralleled the banjo's movement from diasporic traditions into mainstream popular culture. To Dr. Dina, the gourd is central. Grown on her farm, washed and carefully selected, each gourd demands particular decisions about orientation and placement of the neck. I would describe this as a collaborative process with the natural form. And this connection that I made on the banjo on the left took me the better part of 2 business days of labor to make that connection fit properly. There's no glue holding that together. It's just the wood and the gourd shaved down to meet each other perfectly together. And this is significantly different than the types of banjos that we find with the modern fretted banjo or even our resonator banjos, using a process, again, that was popularized and refined by William Boucher to essentially steam bend pieces of wood into uniform shapes, cutting uniform necks so that you can slap together multiple banjos at once, which makes the process take maybe an hour, not necessarily days. Mavry also incorporates gourds into their builds, but they have a greater emphasis on consistency. While producing multiple instruments in large BBRP workshops, they often select gourds that will allow for more standardized cuts. Though it's not entirely as standard as Boucher's cuts, Mavry, I observed that they were working to try to make it so there was as little fine-tuning as possible for the participants so that children wouldn't have to spend multiple days trying to focus on getting the perfect fit. This ensures that the instruments are playable when they walk out of the workshop and also makes sure that the builders can finish those banjos by the end of that workshop because it does take a long time to put those together. That reliance on gourds underscores the banjo's land-based provenance, yet by the mid-19th century, other builders again started to prioritize wooden rims, a move that signaled an ease of standardization and marked the banjo's shift away from a crafted object to mass-produced item. 20 years after the first Black Banjo Gathering, the Black Banjo Renaissance represents a profound rebirth of Black consciousness and cultural engagement with American roots music. This movement challenges us to examine the banjo as a dynamic site of social transformation where Black practitioners engage with ancestral memory through material practice. Central to this understanding is that the tree remembers. The materials themselves can carry memory and agency. The trees, the gourds, and the hands who grew them retain memories from both near and distant pasts, which is a topic of discussion for my larger work. Future research in the area, I'm also going to meditate on how these materials and memories are activated in performance contexts, particularly exploring the relationship between these ancestral memories in the living wood and stage performances. But without getting into performance analysis, I'd like to invite you all to ask questions, provide feedback, and offer thoughts on my ongoing research project. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great. We have 2 mics, one on either side. If people could raise their hands, and we'll come over to you.
I was wondering, thank you for the talk, yeah. It was lovely. For the Black Banjo Revival piece, were those people mostly playing mass manufactured banjos, or was there also this instinct or desire to return back to more artisanal banjos?
Yeah, so it's sort of a yes and situation. So something that I've observed even with my banjo students is that the mass manufactured banjos are a lot easier to come by. So when most folks begin their banjo journeys, as I've learned with like 50 some interviews or people that I've interviewed, those mass manufactured instruments are easier to start with. And they're also easier to even like when you're playing in other genres to like switch because of that dodecaphonic tuning system. But a parallel that I've seen in the vast majority of the Black participants that I've been working with is that there is a desire to go towards gourd instruments, or even like I didn't talk about the there's like an 18th, 19th century banjo which is in the low tuning, uses the wooden rim technology that's sort of in between. So we see folks often moving back to those instruments, but also, again, developing fluency in all of those practices. Like similar to me, when I started playing banjo, I was playing in an old-time context specifically, and I still mostly play in old-time contexts. But I started with the modern fretted, and then I started learning the minstrel banjo things, and now I have the gourd things, and now I just kind of like whip out whichever banjo makes the most sense for the moment that I'm participating in. Yeah, there's one in the back.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this presentation, by the way. I was curious, when I was listening to your sound samples, there's a great fluidity in the factory-produced ones, and I guess they're made so that you can do those good Scruggs-style runs easily. And I was wondering what sort of repertoire there is. Are there printed books of gourd banjo-friendly tunes that we can, learn from?
Sure. So the gourd banjo is a very versatile instrument. You can pretty much play anything that you can play on a modern fretted banjo and a gourd banjo. It's just differences of technique. But there is also a book that's coming out in like a couple weeks. Christina's laughing in her chair. Called Go Back and Fetch It. Which has a lot of documentation. It has tablature and notation for fiddle and banjo tunes from historic periods. But there's also a number, so like the Briggs corn shucking jig came from an 1855 manual, because in the 1850s there was a period of increased interest of the banjo becoming like a parlor instrument. So people started selling like these books and instruction manuals on how to like play the instrument, and that's where that tune came from. And that was constructed for the like 19th century, some people call it like the minstrel era banjo, which is sort of an in-between between the gourd and the modern fretted. So there's those resources, but I'd highly recommend Christina's book because it has work that she's done reconstructing these objects, but it also worked with Rhiannon Giddens to help come up with some of the notation practices. So when that book comes out, I'd highly recommend it.
Thank you.
Yeah, totally.
Thank you. Hi. So the process of standardization that you talked about is something that's common to lots of production processes, and has had big impacts on the workers who were involved. Primarily that less skill was required as the materials, the technologies became more standardized, but that also engendered a lot of resistance on the part of the workers. And so I'm wondering if you have anything to tell us about the effects on banjo makers and the resistance they might have offered.
Sure. So that standardization process happened really around the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. That's not an area like that specific time period is like the one time period that I'm really rusty on. But I would say in this contemporary moment, there is, in some ways has always been, a constellation of builders. Most commonly, we're finding those mass-produced instruments, but you also have other shops that have been continuing to exist. Like I'm thinking about, I have another banjo that was built by Patrick Sawyer, who owns a company called Pisgah Banjos in North Carolina, and that's a smaller, they call it a factory, but there's like, they make like 10 banjos at a time, that situation. So there's definitely a spectrum of in between, but a lot of folks are playing these mass manufactured instruments made in other parts of the country. There are other scholars, I'm thinking about one person at Duke whose name escapes me right now, who has been talking a lot about the economies of wood construction and shipping like woods specifically from West Virginia to go to China to build American folk instruments, which creates an interesting economic system. But my study primarily is focused on Black folks who are interested in having a relationship with the object itself, like scraping the insides of the gourds, shaving down the instruments, not necessarily for the idea of it being like quote unquote artisan, because that's a very sort of like vague, ambiguous space, but for the purposes of having, again, a relationship with the object and putting your own personal energy and intention into it. So that's what I've been seeing.
Hello?
Yeah.
Hi, thank you. So thank you for this fascinating talk, and you have me thinking about bodies and embodiment, and whether the banjo is also an embodiment as well as an object, and then differences between objects as objects and objects as sort of springboard for performance. So as you're talking, I'm remembering that we're sitting in a room with a suite of Stradivarius violins over to the side, and of course the fiddle was also another African-American instrument in the American diaspora. I was just wondering if you have any reflections about what might be similar or different about sort of a Stradivarius violin to, let's say, the ideal of the African diasporic banjo that may or may not have survived. But, you see what I'm saying?
Sure. I mean, there was definitely a difference in documentation and preservation of instruments, because though the strads are organic material, because of the valuation systems that European museum workers and culture bearers and all these things over the last couple hundred years have been more intentional about that sort of preservation. I have not explored or done in-depth research with some of those older, like extant, like pre-1850s banjos. Actually, there's someone in the room who has done that. But so a lot of those instruments are just found in archives, not really kept or thought of. We keep discovering new banjos every couple of years that were previously not really documented very well. But also, I struggle with and some of my colleagues might disagree with me, but I struggle with the consistent relating of the banjo and the fiddle as like inseparable, because that is a very like American construction. Banjo has its own lineage, the fiddle has its own lineage, and they come together and interact in different spaces, but ultimately the banjo is its own object that has its own history, its own lineages, its own pidgin practices, as opposed to fiddling, which there are a variety, as Dr. JJ talked about in Fiddling in West Africa, a variety of indigenous African fiddling traditions that are similar constructions to like the Stradivarius, as well as in the Americas, when we start seeing in plantation culture, we start seeing banjos and fiddles being performed together. That's not to say that there is no role of those relationships, but I think that it's important to separate those in our mind, because I think that the constant reimagining of the fiddle and the banjo as inseparable does a lot of violence, not just for the past, but also for the future, because there are so many banjo players. I remember now I'm going on a tangent. I was at a festival a little while back, and I was giving a talk, and somebody asked me why the banjo renaissance only exists in old-time spaces, and I laughed. I probably shouldn't have in that space, but because there are so many musicians who are doing work with the banjo that are not like playing fiddle or playing old-time music. Like I'm thinking about like Demeanor, who is a rapper who plays banjo. I think about Jake, who's doing like house music. Kaya, who's doing songwriting and film scoring and all these things. So I think that it's very dangerous to limit our discussion of the banjo to only a partner to the fiddle. But that was a little.
Thanks. Joe, I was wondering if either Hannah or Dina talk about the kind of this idea of like form to construction to use. Because essentially, even though the form is important, that they're getting these organic materials that have meaning to them, essentially the use is still performance, right? It's still musical performance, not ritual musical performance, social musical performance. And I'm wondering if in your discussions with them, they talk about that at all, and talk about how then the construction really does favor performance rather than ritual.
Sure, yeah, so it does definitely favor performance, and that's actually like the performance part of this project. But when I was talking about use, I probably should have been a little bit clearer. It's not just like how you use the object once it's done, but using the banjo, the concept of having a banjo build. Like, we're building banjos, we're going to bring a community together to create this object, as that's like a social function of it, which in a lot of African American cultures, though it might not be particular, like specifically religious, getting together to make something is like it's like a social event, you know? Like I got together with my grandmother and my aunties to like snap peas. I got together with my cousins to help set the table for Thanksgiving dinner, and that was like a social event. And getting together with Dina and Samaria to build these instruments together in some ways is more important than necessarily making like a pristine artisanal object that's like primarily for performance. Yeah, so that's what I was getting at. We can talk more later, yeah.
Maybe one more question.
Dear brother, wonderful presentation. Thank you, Brother Joe. I'm a recipient of the Black Appalachian Storytellers Fellowship, and we were part of our fellowship award was a beautiful gift, including a gourd from Sister Dina. So thank you for describing even more parts of her wonderful legacy, and we'll have to visit her. We are meeting in Atlanta in November as part of the Black Storytellers Festival, and the question is, you're welcome to come and be a part of that. But the question I have, it has to do, I wish you the best as you matriculate through Indiana University and you try to unravel this idea of being colonized and going and taking this Euro construct of how we have a lens of the world being separate, based upon this Newtonian, Cartesian, things being separate. Mm-hmm. And trees are 200 million years old, the ones that are flowering. So yes, they carry knowledge. Mm-hmm. And the way forward, our dear friend Tony K. Bambara has a quote that says, the role of an artist, which is all of us and you, is to make revolution irresistible, which means transformation of us as a species. So the question is, how do you see using the work of Octavia Butler about Afrofuturism, mm-hmm. about the banjo and the interplay of our species maturation?
Whew. How long do y'all got? So yeah, that's, oh, my brain is going so many places. I've been thinking a lot about the ways that we're telling stories. And actually, when you brought up Octavia Butler, I was immediately brought back to my friend Jake's album, The New Faith, where he was, and other folks are in the same way, envisioning spaces that render, again, Blackness as dead and also American culture as dead, and creating these vessels and these like sort of like capsules where we can move forward and backward through time simultaneously to commune with our ancestors in our musical practices. And I see a lot of folks starting to lean into a number of African diasporic musical forms. Like I was saying with Demeanor, who's doing rap, and Jake's who's doing more in house music these days. But then also I'm seeing folks who are starting to incorporate banjo into like go-go music and finding ways to mobilize the banjo to induce trance and to work with trance, as well as I'm thinking about the Chesapeake Conjure Society, who has been really starting to engage with some of those ideas of using these gourds, and we've actually been in some conversation about trying to do work together about activating that into like an active world building space. But essentially, by maintaining this knowledge and also by reclaiming this knowledge of like that constructing materials, like what Dr. Dina said about using what was around, right? By having that knowledge is also like thinking about the knowledge that I've been gaining. I've been gardening a lot this year, and I've been learning how to can, and I've been learning how to preserve food. I've been learning how to, though I'm not fully self-sustaining right now, that idea of creating a maroon, creating space, and preparing for what might come in this contemporary moment, knowing that the United States might not be around forever, as no empire ever is, and preparing for what's to come.
Right. And thank you so much. Would everybody join me in thanking Joe Johnson for